So these things, in my opinion, are like largely ephemeral. They will not last forever. So my goal is to get them back in a playable state to enjoy while we still have them. But if you disagree with anything, I invite you to give me feedback afterwards to take into consideration, particularly if there's a very technical reason for why you should do things. But gaming is very different from things like, say, automotive repair, which we've been doing for like 100 years now. You've got a whole bunch of people on the internet who have like, oh, do this with a Post-it note or whatever, or do this with a magic eraser, or do this with an actual like rubber eraser or whatever. There's all these kind of weird ad hoc solutions to problems. Like, remember when we used to like wrap an Xbox 360 in a towel and then put it in a suitcase and then run it? Like, the idea was that it would heat the system up so hot that the solder around the GPU would like basically reflow, but then you're just further damaging the system in the process. So a lot of these things are just kind of like, you had to kind of figure them out and see whether or not they worked or not. But as I've already said, one of the biggest contributors to the deterioration of video games is neglect. So with that in mind, I'd like to start with some best practices that should help eliminate or at least reduce the need for future restoration efforts. So, with the exception of general neglect or direct abuse, these are the biggest contributors to something needing restoration in the first place. Light, heat, water and moisture, dust and dirt, food and drink, and pets and pests, and smoke. So what's so bad about light, you ask? For one thing, it bleaches things. The UV radiation in sunlight breaks down the chemical bonds in the pigments of ink, causing it to fade. Given enough time, it can bleach things completely white. If you've ever moved out after multiple years without ever changing your curtains, you should know this. We had burgundy red curtains in our first apartment for 9 years. When we moved out, they were more or less completely white on the other side. Also, fun fact, this isn't a real photo because it hasn't been photographed, in decades. But the United States flag from the initial moon landing should be completely white by now, because there's no atmosphere, there's no ozone layer, there's nothing protecting it. So any UV light that it's exposed to, just all that pigment's going to be gone. Also, discoloration. Again, UV radiation reacting with plastics, causing them to yellow. Although in this case, as a result of oxidation of the polymer, which leaves behind chromatic particles with a yellow color. You may have heard of retrobrighting. There's been multiple methods that have been developed over the years, but contrary to what many have said over the years, and like one thing that I believed was that it would re-strengthen the plastic. If anything, it further weakens it in order to restore the original color. There's not very good scientific analysis of how much it damages the plastic, but basically it greatly speeds up that oxidation process. But in the process, it breaks down the yellow chromatic particles that cause discoloration faster than they can reform. But again, you are further breaking down that plastic, which may make them brittle and prone to chipping and cracking. There are many methods and services that that can do it for you, but do it at your own risk. But this is definitely backyard science stuff you can do. But what can I do? Keep things out of direct sunlight. Use heavy curtains. Store things in opaque tubs rather than transparent ones. And very specifically, UV window film. Okay? And not just your games. Your movie collection, your Funko Pops, your posters, literally everything. Any collectible you have. Your Legos. So I recommend lining your windows with UV-resistant film. The brand that I use is Gila, as in Gila. It's supposed to block 99% of UV rays and reject 72% of the sun's heat. It also helps insulate during the winter, and from the outside acts as a privacy barrier. It's kind of cool. It actually looks like a mirror from the other side. I did some real basic test of this. I took some old artwork. It might be hard to see in the projection, but I took some old artwork and sliced it into thirds. I put a control in a closet. I put one in my game room where I had the film, and then one in a window without the film facing west for 3 to 6 months. I kind of lost track of how long I was in there. I should have wrote the date on it, but I did not. And I could tell, like right away, like this one that was in the room without the film, like all the color is kind of like wrong, like it's more like purplish. But like the original art in the window with the film was still original, and like I compared it to the control, could not tell a difference. So window film. Heat. Generally speaking, heat is an accelerant. For example, if a capacitor or battery is going to go bad and leak inside of a cartridge, controller, or system, heat is going to speed that process up. So ideally, don't put your games in the hottest part of the house. Like, don't do an attic game room, for example. Have an air conditioner, obviously. Also, make sure your game consoles have adequate airflow and operate at room temperature so they don't overheat. If it's like 85 degrees in your game room, don't run your PS5. It seems intuitive, but don't. Water and moisture can cause a lot of different problems. Don't keep your video games in the basement. It's not a matter of if your basement will flood, it's when. Water destroys, molds, rusts, or shorts out just about everything it's exposed to, so the best thing you can do is keep your games at ground level or higher and away from plumbing. I have to confess I'm pretty bad about mitigating dust in my game room. Dust, dirt, and hair can block airflow and impact system cooling. It can get into controller stick assemblies. It can get like physically on an optical lens, inside the laser motors and inside system fans. So regularly dusting and periodically spraying out your system with compressed air or an air compressor is recommended. I recently read a book about the history of the original Xbox, and the industrial designer of it said that he designed the system so that all of the openings and venting were on the sides and the bottom. Because in his user research, he kept finding that people would sit food and drink on their game consoles. This feels very much like a no-brainer, but keep food and drink separate from your games, and ideally like wash or rinse your hands before handling your controllers, because you've got so much like oils like in your hands. Like, I hate it right now. My hands are like wrecked from like the cold, but like I find myself like not using moisturizer because like I'm just playing stuff and I don't want to have like greasy hands. But speaking of food, pests. Less so pets and more so pests. While some cats like to chew on cables, mice love to chew on cables. And bugs and spiders love to find dark, warm places where they can hide. Not to gross any of you out, but no matter how clean your home is, somewhere in your home, there's probably at least one dead little critter inside of something. Maybe your TV, maybe a laptop, maybe a game console. They find themselves in the most baffling of places. So, in a PS2 case, there's a bunch of screws. Some of them are hidden under the rubber feet, but there's these little plastic covers, okay, that cover up the screw wells. I once found a whole dead spider curled up underneath one of these things. I don't know how it got in there. The seam around this is thinner than a gift card. It wasn't a little spider. It was like the size of the whole well, like the size of an eraser head, was somehow underneath this thing. Like, did somebody just put it in there for safekeeping? Like, it just seems physically impossible to me, but they get into all kinds of places. Smoke. Whether it is from weed, vape, or cigarettes, game consoles will trap particles from smoke within themselves, particularly in the cooling systems. Cigarettes are especially bad because tar sticks to everything. And then your game system will pretty much always smell like smoke. Unless you do a full tear down and deep clean, if you or someone in your household smokes inside the home, you want to regularly blow out your consoles with compressed air or an air compressor. Fortunately, like the residue from like vape and weed kind of like doesn't really stick to stuff, so it like can usually blow out pretty easily. But like you still want to like blow out your consoles eventually, on a regular basis. So once again, light, heat, water, moisture, dust, dirt, food, drink, pets, pests, and smoke. These are the sorts of things to keep in mind when caring for your games and keeping them in working order for as long as possible. So, real quick, hardware storage. The way I store all my stuff, like particularly like controllers, I will take the cable and I will kind of coil it up in a coil about that big, just so that way like there's no bends in the cable. I will put a wire tie around it. I'll put it inside a Ziploc bag, and then I'll put it in a storage tub, and then I'll put it in the closet. And that way, like, everything is just protected from everything and stays clean and stays tidy and orderly. And that way things don't scuff each other up, cables don't get, yanked on. And particularly in terms of storage tubs, because they're made out of plastic, which is a polymer. When they're brand new, they are still undergoing a chemical reaction, which is referred to as off-gassing. So whenever you buy a new storage tub, preferably on a warm, sunny day, put it outside for like 4 to 8 hours to let it vent, basically. Sometimes you might get like a game cartridge that has all these weird little bubbles coming out of it for some reason. That's basically a chemical burn. And like if you put stuff in a brand new storage tub, if that gas kind of gets like trapped inside that space, it can actually cause like damage to stuff, or it can affect the capacitors or whatever else is like flowing into with airflow into and around the thing. So when you get a new storage tub, put it outside for a couple of hours. Whenever possible, I prefer to get a game complete with its original case, for one thing, for the sake of completeness, but also for the added protection from exposure, drops, and so on. There are aftermarket cases, obviously, for pretty much every kind of game. Who here has their games at home in one of these right now? Okay. Do not do this. Do not store your discs in sleeves or wallets or binders if you can, okay? In a game case, like a DVD case, basically the only point of contact is that clear part of the spindle at the very in the very center of the disc where there is no data, okay? But when you put your disc in a sleeve, it is making contact on all sides, okay? Every time you take it in or out, every time you pick up the binder, every time like there's a little unperceptible earthquake or whatever, or you're just walking around the house and the shelves kind of do like one of these, the discs inside of it are going to move. They're going to basically sand themselves inside of the thing. You're causing micro scratches on both the disc, like the shiny side, but also the label side. That's where the data is. So if you can, don't store them in one of these. Some general principles here, all right? Test all the things, okay? If you get a new controller, like if you buy something from eBay or you find something at a garage sale, before you clean it, before you do anything with it, test it. You don't want, like for one thing, if you say you have a Super Nintendo controller and like the start or select button don't work, or you have to press them really, really hard, then you know what to look out for. That means like the contacts underneath of it need to be cleaned really well. So what to look out for, but two, you don't want to like say service a console like a PS3 or an Xbox 360 and come to find out, oh, the Wi-Fi doesn't work. And then it doesn't work for your purposes, but you've expended all that effort to like clean it or service it or whatever. So always do a good like functionality check of anything before you use it or clean it or service it. For like most of your controllers, like your Xbox 360, your PS4, PS5, etc., there's Gamepad Tester online. You might need to get drivers for particular controllers like PS3 or PS4 controllers, but you can see all the buttons, what they're doing. You can test the vibration. You can test the stick assemblies down here to see where they are, whether they're jittery, whether they go in a good circle. In specific homebrew applications, like Wii Homebrew, there are specific community-developed tools to test things. The one for the Wii tests remotes, nunchucks, classic controllers, even the guitars. The PS2 has one for like that homebrew. Pretty much everything has one, even for like the older systems that are just completely cartridge-based and don't have an OS. You can get an EverDrive, and put that utility as a ROM on the cartridge to test things pretty thoroughly. Otherwise, just pick a game that you know really well, that uses all the buttons. Like if you're testing a PS2 controller out, just get like Unreal Tournament or something like that, like a first-person shooter where you use both sticks. Halo 3 for a 360, just whatever game you know really well, preferably something that has good dual stick functionality, just to see what it's doing. And for starters, you want to get yourself a basic driver set, because you're going to want to get inside of these things. Like if you can get inside of a system, inside of a controller, you can do a lot more inside than you can outside. Even if you're just trying to clean the seams around the controller where all like your hand gunk and stuff kind of gets trapped in, just being able to actually take the controller apart and scrub it, you're going to get much better results with it. This iFixit kit on Amazon is like, I don't want to say it's like 10 or something dollars. It was like it's very cheap, but it has like the security game bits that you need to get inside of Nintendo cartridges. It has a variety of flatheads and Phillips heads. It's got tri-wing drivers. It's got the various security torque screws that you need to get inside of like Microsoft stuff. Get yourself a basic toolkit, preferably one that has all the drivers you need. This one in particular that I found has everything. So speaking of screws, again, this is a very basic thing, but this is kind of what we're talking about. There is a correct way to put a screw back into something. If you're not aware, what you want to do is you want to actually go counterclockwise in the opposite direction and find the end of the thread. You'll hear like a little click, or it'll kind of like drop down a little bit and you'll hear a little noise. That's the end of the thread, and then you want to start screwing in. So that is the end of the thread. So you basically want to go in the reverse direction, find the other thread, and then go the other way. Otherwise, you're going to bore into the thread of the stick or the strut in the wrong direction. You're going to basically tear up that strut, and then the screw might not stay inside of it, and then or it won't have the correct tightness, and then the controller won't stay together. In some cases. Also, if you take a screw out, you might notice that there's like a little bit of, I think I just put myself down a little bit. There we go. You might also notice sometimes there's a little bit of plastic at the end of the screw tip. Sometimes you want to clean that off so that you can actually put the screw back in correctly. Let's see, I think I'm done with that. One of the big jumps that you can do in terms of like getting things like super clean is to get an air compressor. You can get one, like a good one, for like $250 to $300. It's a bit of an investment, but like this is like an essential tool. Particularly if you're like cleaning things with water. Water has minerals in it, so you don't want to have like fluoride and stuff like in the cracks and parts of everything that you're cleaning. You don't want to have residue from that. So like an air compressor is very helpful with like drying things, getting any of those like residual minerals off of it. You don't even really need to use soap in a lot of cases, but you don't want to have any kind of residue whatsoever on things. And also like water can get trapped up inside of like buttons, and then you have to like wait forever for it to dry before you put it back in a controller. So an air compressor is extremely useful. It's also very helpful for like blowing out a system. Like if you're not going to fully tear something down, like what you want to do preferably, like if we're talking like a PS3, like a PS3 Slim, it's very easy to remove the top of it. Or a PS4, like basically like on a PS4 shell, you just basically pull at the opposite corners and the whole shell comes off. Like just clips, and then you can just spray out the fan and everything and get like 90% of what's trapped inside of it out. So like if you're willing to invest in it, and like anecdotally, in our office, just for a little bit of airflow, and because like, we have this really little quiet fan, so it doesn't come up on recordings or live streams or anything like that, just a little fan. I sprayed it out with an air compressor like a month ago, and holy crap, there was so much stuff trapped inside of it, like in the motor and everything. It's helpful to spray out your PC every so often, your keyboard, all sorts of things. It's very useful. And if you want to get into model kit building, you can get an air proj attachment for it. Another like jump up that you can get is a soldering station. You can get one for like sub $300, and it is very useful for many, many things, like replacing the batteries in your cartridges. Very simple, very good introductory soldering thing to do is replace your batteries in your controllers, your Game Boy cartridges, your Pokemon cartridges. A lot of those are like 30-something years old in some cases, so they need to be replaced, and it's pretty easy to do. Even as a novice for soldering, but there's plenty of applications replacing damaged cable wires. You can also use them to, like if you have a Wii remote or something like that had battery corrosion, you can very easily like desolder the battery connectors and replace them, and then you have a working controller again. For under about $100, you can get an ultrasonic cleaner. and that will kind of like aid you in cleaning things, getting into like really fine, areas of things. You can clean your jewelry with them, your eyeglasses in some cases. If you get like a controller that's really really bad, and you open it up inside and there's just like soda all over the motherboard, you can put the whole motherboard for the controller in the cleaner with isopropyl alcohol, and it's electronic safe, so it will clean off all of that gunk, and then theoretically should look brand new afterwards. But it'll help kind of cut down on like water damage to your hands so that you're not wrecked. You'll encounter stickers an awful lot. I used to use just like a hair dryer just to like heat up the sticker so it's easy to remove. Just use Goo Gone. Just use Goo Gone. Just get a cotton swab, put a little Goo Gone very specifically just on the label itself. I know stickers really well now, so like I know like a modern GameStop sticker I can get off I can just the whole thing in one go. But ideally, like for things that I can't get off, I will try to at least like get like the top layer of the sticker off, just so there's like a point of access for the goo to like get in, because there's always like a top layer to every sticker, and sometimes that's resistant to stuff like this. So I like to kind of try and get a little bit of the top layer off. But for like your typical cartridge-based game, where you have an artwork underneath of a plastic film, get yourself an old, one, remove the art. Two, get yourself an old gift card, put it between the hard plastic and the soft plastic, and then get yourself a little scrapey boy. After like it's set for like an hour, and you can just gently scrape it off, and then reapply as necessary. For stickers that are actually physically on the artwork, there's only so much you can do, because the Goo Gone will leave residue in the artwork and cause more damage to it in the process. Really, the only thing you can do for something like that is get yourself a heat gun, and very carefully use a scraper and a heat gun to try to get as much of the label off, the sticker off in one go, and hopefully when you're done with it, it should not look too bad. But there's always going to be some amount of residue, and fortunately you won't have to feel it because it's underneath the clear plastic. But Sharpie, everybody wants to know that. Mom wants you to know this is Dalton's NES game. In a lot of cases, if it's like the back of the cartridge, you can just very easily like back swap it. But if you actually want to clean it off, it's possible. For starters, just get some isopropyl alcohol, get a cotton swab, try to get as much of it off as possible the first time. You'll get like maybe 90% of the way there. And then a magic eraser. In a lot of cases, a magic eraser is like the tool of last resort, because it is basically like sandpaper. If you think about an NES cartridge, it has a very specific texture to it. It's not completely smooth. And a lot of like an Xbox 360 controller has a texture to it. It's not completely smooth. But a magic eraser will take some of that away. So there's like a give and take with this, is like, what are you trying to accomplish? So if you're very careful, you can get like most of the remainder of the Sharpie off with the magic eraser without doing too much damage to the plastic. But I think like even if you're taking away a little bit of that texture, it's better than this. But if you really, really are patient, this is what I used to do. I used to just use a cheap electric toothbrush, and just spend like 10 minutes just doing this on the Sharpie, because it's non-abrasive, and eventually it will break up. Like, provided it hasn't fully soaked into the plastic, it will break up that Sharpie. In a lot of cases, it just takes a long damn time. Games specifically, discs. So I want to talk about discs real quick, like the variety that there are, for two reasons. One, in terms of like testing your systems, you should know that there are a variety of discs, but also like what you can accomplish with them. You've got CDs, you've got DVDs, you got Blu-rays, you got GD-ROMs for Dreamcast, which are kind of like CDs, but they're not a CD and they're not a DVD. GameCube has a proprietary mini DVD format, and then the PlayStation Portable had UMDs. They're all in some level kind of the same, but one thing to note is that there are multiple layers on some disc types. Like DVDs and Blu-rays have, DVDs have a single layer and dual layer. Blu-rays have single, double, triple, and quadruple layers. You can tell if you look at the underside of the disc on the outside of the spindle, there's a registration barcode. So there's one for every single layer. And this is important because if you're testing, like I say, a PS2, and you just grab like any old silver disc game like Tony Hawk 3, silver disc, single layer DVD game, and it's like, oh, great, it works. Did you test it with God of War? Did you test it with Gran Turismo 4? Did you test it with Rock Band? Those are dual layer DVD games, and your lens might not read them anymore. Or they might read your dual layer discs, but not your single layer. Or they might not read CDs. So like a PS2, you got to test with every single disc type: CD, DVD, dual layer DVD. Same thing with like a PS4. We're not there yet probably, but like eventually, well, does your PlayStation 4 read single, double, and triple layer discs? The anatomy of a disc is basically you've got the major portion. This is not the scale, obviously, but your major portion is the bottom like plastic layer. And then you've got your metal film layer, which has the actual data. And then you've got a plastic layer on top of that between it and the label. But all your data is basically in here. Like this is all like the gray, the red, and the blue. That's like just basically the very top, very thin layer. So if you have any games that have top scratches, there's nothing you can do. If you can look through a scratch on the disc and see light on the other side, that data's gone. Data is written from the inside out. So like if you have a scratch down here, you're in really bad shape. If you've got a scratch out here, you're probably fine. But you could get here and like the game could crash. It could fail to load a cutscene. It could fail to load a music track could skip. Or like I have a copy of Xenogears where disc 1 has some disc rot on it, and it won't load certain textures. So everybody in the town is just this like missing no looking thing. But disc rot is a real thing, and you can find it. This is a very extreme case, but you can find it on like really old games. So whenever you get a new game, like a PlayStation 1 game, get a really strong light and look through it and see if you can see any holes in it. Typically what you see is something like this, a very tiny point of light where you can look through it. Again, it could be a major asset or it could be very specific game code, and you could get halfway through the game and then just crash and you can't play any further. So look out for it, and if you can avoid buying discs that look like this, do. Blu-rays are a very hardy disc type. They are very resistant to scratching, but once they're scratched, they're scratched. But if they're just dirty, if they've got smudges on them, you can use just basic glass cleaner. Get yourself some soft paper towels. And this seems very obvious, but you've got rough paper towels and you've got soft paper towels. They have that like peely kind of consistency where you have to like peel them off the rolls, and they don't have like that quilted pattern on them. Do not use rough paper towels. Use soft paper towels. And then you can basically, if it doesn't have any scratches on it, you can get it looking brand new if it has any smudges on it. For everything else, for CDs, for DVDs, for GameCube discs, for everything else, do not try to clean them yourself. Find somebody that has one of these. This is an Elm EcoMaster. This is like basically the cornerstone of any like retro game business, okay? They're a $20,000 machine. They were $9,000 machines before COVID, but they are $20,000 machines now. So fortunately for you, I did the legwork. I called everybody in the Baltimore and DC market, so I know all the machines that we have in the area. So Arcana's video games in Oakton has an Eco Pro 2. They're the little desktop ones. They're not as good, but it's made by the same company. Superbit Video Games in Annandale has one of them as well. And these people also do as a service. Arcana's does it for $2 a disc. Superbit also does it for $2 a disc. I called Starland in Chantilly, Virginia. They're a big warehouse kind of place. They would not tell me. The first person I talked to was like, "Oh, I don't know. Hold on, I'll get you to somebody." And I think I got to a manager, and she was just like, "We're not allowed to give that information out." And I'm like, "Why?" And he's like, "We're not allowed to. It's policy." And I'm like, "But you do. This is a service you provide, right?" And she's like, "Yes." So, and I'm like, "Well, some are better than others. So like, you know, you can't tell me what model it is?" And she's like, "No." And then she's like, well, I don't actually know what it is. And I'm like, but you just said you couldn't tell me, and now you're saying you don't know what it is. So that leads me to believe they have one of these, and they've had problems where people have tried to buy it from them. Time Warp in Ellicott City has an EcoMaster. They do it for $3 a disc. Regen in Towson also has an EcoMaster. They do it for $4 to $2 a disc with volume pricing. And also Sysquick, that also operates as console repairs in Parkville, also does it for $4 to $2 a disc. So once again, Arcana's video games, Supervit video games, eStarland, Time Warp, Regen, and Sysquick all have a machine in this family, and they can get your games looking brand new. This is one of the worst discs that I saw with like these weird like fractal patterns all over it. It looked like the data layer was disadhering from the disc, but after it went through an EcoMaster, it looked brand new. Do not get one of these. Just do not. Just find somebody that can do it for you and get your discs running again. So this anecdotally, the game community likes to find weird, like crittery back scientist kind of ways of fixing things. There is no way to resurface a UMD as far as I'm aware. But fortunately, they're kind of hardy as far as like an optical disc goes. I think because of their size, which is kind of weird because like GameCube discs are extremely finicky. But I'm not recommending you do this, but this is just kind of like an anecdote for like, here's all the weird shit that people do. This guy just basically he had a broken UMD. You can't take the disc out unless it's broken. He just held the disc, got some like compound, and just took like a drill bit and just buffed it like while he was holding it. Apparently it worked for him, but like again, don't do this. Like find the tried and true tested methods for things. I wanted to also talk about like how to properly clean a cartridge. There are 3 basic types of game cartridges. So you've got ROM cartridges like an NES or Game Boy Advance, SNES, N64. You've got ROM cards like a Sega Master System or a TurboGrafx, and then you've got flash cards like 3DS, regular DS, Switch, Vita. For a cartridge, like a ROM cartridge, one thing, don't do this. Obviously, don't do this. You've got so much bacteria and moisture in your mouth. But this is why we're bringing this up is because we're actually reversing this process. We all used to do this, and we were idiots, but we used to do this. So like the pins of most of your games probably look something like this. You can see all this this oxidation, the patina, as they say, on your cartridges. This is very typical, even of a game that's been like taken decent care of. So as I was saying earlier, like you want to get a proper bit to open up the cartridge and get inside of it. If you don't have a bit, the most you can do is use a cotton swab and some IPA and just clean it, but you're not going to get rid of like that actual corrosion. Get Brasso. This is very controversial in the gaming space, but it works, okay? But you have to actually open up the cartridge at some point to clean it. Otherwise, this is what's going to happen. Like if you have any games that you open up and they look like this, that's because they cleaned them with Brasso, but they didn't open up the cartridge to clean it fully. And Brasso is actually like it will eat into the traces of the pins, which is why people say don't use it, because people are lazy and they don't know what they're doing. But here's what I do. First up, disassemble the cartridge. Very important. Disassemble the cartridge. Clean the pins with Brasso. Just a little pea of Brasso on the cotton swab. And you do both sides. Just light pressure, not hard pressure, just light pressure. And then you wipe the residue clean with a Clorox wipe. And then you wipe it with either a rough paper towel or a service cloth. Optionally, you then go and clean it with IPA, either a service cloth or a cotton swab, both sides, just to be thorough. Because, like again, you want to fully clean this stuff off. Reassemble and test. You might need to repeat in some cases if it just does not read. But once you've actually tested it, it works perfectly fine, reliably, at least like 3 out of 4 times. then you clean it on the outside. Don't bother cleaning it on the outside unless it actually has been serviced and cleaned and it actually works. But again, if you're going to use this, you have to clean it fully. Otherwise, this is what's going to happen in some cases. You're going to have pin damage. Like, it might be hard to see, but like you can actually see a separation in the trace right there. There's a separation in the trace over here. I think there's also another separation in the trace over here as well. And then your game doesn't read. So that's why that looks like that. Is sometimes people clean it with Brasso, but don't go the extra effort. However, if you have like a damaged cartridge because it has damaged traces, or they're just really, really rusty, the pins are in just dire straight, you can replace the board. Well, a lot of boards are the same. So most of what is on a cartridge, let's see, so let me remember. The program for the game is this one. This is memory. This is the security chip. And then this up top is probably like something specific to this game. Like a specific mapper or something like that the game uses. But the game is just this one right here. So you'll have a game that won't play that looks like this, but you can actually transplant the ROM from one cartridge to another. So like, if you get really lucky and you have a little Samson, but it doesn't play, SDNX, which is like a $10 game, has the exact same board. You can desolder the ROM chip from one board and put it on another, and it will work. Battery replacement is a very simple and straightforward thing. It's probably like an introductory soldering experience, but it's a probable point of failure for most cartridges is they won't save anymore, particularly Pokemon games because they use them so much. If you're interested in getting into soldering, this is a good place to start. Basically, all you got to do is just use a decent size soldering tip and just kind of heat it up, pull the battery up out of the molten solder, and repeat on the other side, whole battery comes out. And then in reverse, you just place the battery down, heat the solder up, maybe even put a little bit of fresh solder on top, boom, it's in there. A very cheap and effective tool to have in this process is a voltage meter. You can use this for a ton of different things. Like the 4-pin power for my dryer in our house went bad, and I was able to test it with the voltage meter and be like, oh yeah, it's bad. It needs to be replaced. It's not providing the sufficient current anymore. But you can place that the leads on that down and just test the voltage to see whether or not it's like if it's empty. And then on the opposite side of that is you put the battery back in, you can test the voltage to verify that it has provided the correct amount of voltage. There's a whole bunch of other things you can do with it if you want to like test like capacitors and things like that to see if they're working correctly. If you pull like the modular power supply out of like a PS1 or a PS4 and you want to test to see if it's working, you can put the leads into that and test the voltage, and it'll tell you whether or not it's working correctly. So if you want to get into some like real basic low level electronic, kind of troubleshooting, voltage meter. For flash memory cards, you can't take them apart. You have to destroy them to take them apart. So can't use Brasso. How do you clean those pins? This is very silly. Toothpicks. You just toothpick every single one of those pins, every single one of them inside of in the enclosure. You just toothpick those pins. Toothpick is just mildly abrasive, and it will kind of rough up that pin, break up some of the corrosion, and then you just use some Q-tips and some rubbing alcohol and just press down into the pins and just wipe away whatever corrosion or whatever is kind of sanded away. ROM cards, very uncommon, but if you have any Turbo games or any Master System games or any other that I'm not remembering right now, you can just clean the pins with some IPA and some Q-tips. I've never needed to do anything more than that. For controllers, here are the basics. Starting with like an NES controller. Like an NES controller is like the most basic controller that you could find. But controllers are all basically the exact same thing when you think about it. You take it apart, and pretty much every controller consists of these same elements. You've got a shell, usually front and back, you've got a motherboard with contacts, and then you've got hard plastic buttons and then soft membranes. Pretty much every single controller. So what I would do is I take the shell and I soak it in hot water, and I put in a separate thing, usually like a jar that has a top that I can agitate. Again, hot water, put the membranes and the buttons inside of it, let it sit for a while, come back to it, and just toothbrush it. Or if like you need to do something a little more intensive, get yourself like one of those like service brushes that has like many different bristles that like is like almost looks like a little iron kind of shape size, and then just kind of scrub around all the seams, like all around the seams. Get into like in an NES controller, there's like little tiny little seams around all these little areas where like basically you've got this thing on top is kind of like adhered to like the shell itself. So there's like all these little gaps. Just get in every nook and cranny. Get some bottle brushes, very important. Bottle brushes, you can clean out all the wells for all of these things really effectively. So clean out the wells, scrub everything else. You want to IPA, cotton swab and IPA the contacts on these things. After you've cleaned like the membranes and dried them off, you want to like give these a little bit of scrub with like some IPA, just kind of like rough them up and clean them up a little bit. And then like theoretically it should all work perfectly fine. So it's mostly just toothbrushing, just get every little bit in every little nook and cranny, and you can get something looking surprisingly new again. The big jump though is stick assemblies. If you don't know this, every stick assembly is pretty much the exact same thing since like the PlayStation 1. The stick assembly in your PlayStation 5 controller is the exact same thing in your PlayStation 1 controller. There's no difference. There's slightly different variations, but like from a conceptual standpoint, a mechanical standpoint, exact same thing. You have two little potentiometers. So like when the stick goes one way, this little thing down here rotates, and that provides like the X position, and then you rotate the other way, and the other one will extrapolate the Y position, and that's how you get your stick that goes in all 360 degrees. It's just a little peg that rotates around and rotates these little potentiometers, and then it's soldered to the bottom of the board. And then when you press it down on it, this little doohickey here, which like you can see the red inside of there, just lowers and presses the little button underneath of there, and that is pretty much everything. Switch controllers, exact same thing. If you have heard like the problems with like stick drift in recent years with like Switch controllers, PS5 controllers, they're not worse. It's just that games like from generation to generation have been more sensitive in terms of like their game programming. So like in your PS2, GameCube, Xbox games, there's like a 30% dead zone, okay? Or 40% dead zone, like 40 to 30% dead zone, and then a 20% dead zone, and then a 10% dead zone. And that's entirely at like the game programming level. It's not the actual sticks. So they're not faulty. Just the way games have been written in terms of like their sensitivity for like Twitch-like movements have become more punctuated. But you can replace these. The level one is if you have any like controllers that like they're jittery, you have to remove the potentiometers from the side with like you basically take an X-Acto knife and you pry these off the side really gently, and then underneath on the inside there's like a ring of carbon where the little dial makes contact inside of it to like basically adjust the voltage, and you can clean that with a cotton swab and IPA. Otherwise, the next step up from that is you actually have to try to replace these potentiometers. Either with a donor or a third-party replacement, which will not be as good, or you have to replace the entire stick assembly with a replacement, either a donor or a third party. You can get third-party stick assemblies. They're just not as good as the originals. They're not as sensitive as the originals. They have bigger dead zones. But it is possible. And a lot of places will do this as a service. But this is like, you really want to get into soldering kind of thing. Battery replacement is obviously a thing that exists. You can very easily do this yourself. You just got to get a replacement battery. If you got a screwdriver, you can get inside your controller and you can replace the battery. 3DSs, DSs is just one little precision screw. It's really easy to do. You should be able to get a replacement battery for like most things for like 10 to 20 bucks. And they're just plug and play. A big thing that you might find is like one of the big points of failure with controllers is broken screw struts. If you ever find a controller that's a maraca, you know, it's just might have a broken strut inside of it. Get some Gorilla Glue, set it for a bit. What I usually try to do is Gorilla Glue it, get the strut in the correct position, and then make sure that it is going up into the other side of the well. Press the remainder of the shell together, rubber band it, leave it for a couple of hours. And then if you've got space inside of the shell, put some hot glue around the base of the strut just to give it a little bit more reinforcement. Cable tears is very common. You can, if the controller just works fine, just electrical tape it just so that you have less exposure to it. But you can obviously get replacement cables. It's just a question of whether or not it is worth it to you as opposed to buying an entirely new controller, and if you want to do some like soldering. Some controller-specific things. Big point of failure with an N64 controller is its thumbstick. Basically just kind of grinds inside of itself. It's not like other stick assemblies. It's its own thing, but it's a pretty bad design. You can very easily get a replacement either in the original style, the GameCube style. If you've ever heard of Hall effect stick assemblies, which use magnets instead of potentiometers, you can get one of those, which should theoretically be immune to drift. One of the biggest things that I find that is wrong with Xbox 360 controllers, aside from like their thumbsticks being torn up, is this little tiny shoulder like bumper button. I've read all kinds of different like solutions for it, like putting little bits of Post-it notes between it to give it a little bit extra height, putting a little bit of super glue, like dabbing super glue on like the plastic peg that presses down on the button. And for years, I couldn't figure out like what is a good solution for this. And then one day I was just looking at it and I was like, hey, I wonder, I could just press it up and just bend it up so it's flush with the board again. And that was the solution. And I was like, man, I feel dumb. But I could not find anybody on the internet who was just saying like, oh yeah, that's all you got to do. And I was like, wow. And I was like, I felt real dumb but real smart at the same time. It was very strange. Also, this is the exact same assembly that's like in for a light gun. So it's funny, you can transplant some parts from like completely different things that you would never think about. I fixed a light gun by just transplanting like a dead 360 controller button assembly into like a Sega light gun. It was the exact same thing. Wii remotes. So many Wii remotes are dead because of batteries. But fortunately, there is pretty easy, like provided the corrosion isn't all the way down to the board, you can take it out, like take the batteries out, 2, scrub the contacts with a toothbrush and some isopropyl alcohol and see if it works. If it doesn't, you can replace this little metal bit up there because it's not really, it's just basically held into, it's just pressure fit. And then there's like 2 contacts down here that are soldered into the board that you can actually remove. If you want, you can try using some vinegar for like what I do is I take a little tiny jar, a little bit of vinegar, any corroded contacts that like I can physically remove from whatever it is, rusted screws, you just put in that for like a minute, like just a minute, and just kind of agitate it for a bit, and then dump it out, and then rinse it really well. The vinegar will break it down, but if you leave it for like more than 5 to 10 minutes, it will eat away all of the conductive plating on the outside of the contact. You can replate things. Again, backyard sciencey shit, but you can replate really, really corroded things. You just basically need like a piece of the metal, some leads, and a battery. That's all it is. You can replate stuff. Again, some backyard sciencey stuff to think about if you really want to do some weird stuff. So many dead PS3 controllers are not dead. They basically have their foam inside of them has gone bad. If you're not aware, basically you got like a flex PCB on top of a plastic skeleton, and underneath there is a motherboard. And on the motherboard, there is this contact that makes contact with this. And there is a little bit of foam that pressures it together. But that foam breaks down and smushes down eventually. So this is very, very ad hoc. But if you take just a little bit of cardboard or another little bit of foam and just give it a little bit of extra thickness and then take some double-sided tape and wrap it around it and put it back in, it'll work flawlessly. It's real MacGyver-y shit. Some system-specific things. Who here has an original Xbox at home? Has it had its clock capacitor removed? Good. So, if you're not aware, the original Xbox has a clock capacitor instead of a coin button battery, and is a faulty design, and basically they were all dead by the time you bought it. But they can also go bad, and they can leak and ruin your motherboard. Don't bother replacing them unless you know a very specific game that uses the internal clock. If you can think of one, if you can't, don't bother replacing it. Just remove it, and then your system won't die. I don't know what is going on with like the manufacturing of console boards these days, but PS5s have damaged HDMI ports like all day, every day, left and right. Feels like very obvious stuff, but when you have a system set up, make sure like you don't like push it back in your media center, causing like stress on the port to go left or right or up or down. If you're taking your game console with you somewhere, unplug the cables. Don't leave them plugged in and then wrap it around the console and stuff it in your backpack. You're going to have a bad time. Again, I feel like this is very obvious stuff, but like I see this all the time. And, you know, it can cost you a lot to have it replaced. I hardly ever see broken PS3 or Xbox 360 HDMI ports, but like PS5s, man, just all the time. If you have an NES, you can replace the pin capacity, the 72 pin connector inside of it. It was a faulty design. You probably know this, but like you can get a replacement. You can also bend the pins back into place. That's the only main point of failure for cartridge-based systems. They're all very hardy. It's really hard for them to die, and if they die, it's because there's an actual motherboard failure. Replace the pins on your NES. For everything else, like a Sega Genesis or an N64, I would just get a toothbrush and a little bit of isopropyl alcohol and just scrub inside the connector a little bit and then blow it out. But like if your games are clean, that's going to get you more than halfway. Little PSA about optical laser assemblies. You can replace them. They're very complicated. It is out of the purview of this to like kind of talk about how to service them. Like it would just be its all whole thing, okay? But you might hear about this. Every laser assembly has what's called a potentiometer. It's basically a voltage meter. Some people will actually suggest adjusting it to give the laser more power, but that is the like thing of last resort. You know, there's half a dozen reasons why a laser assembly in a console will not work anymore, and you have to basically figure out that it's not any of those things before you do this. Otherwise, you will burn out your system, and then it will not work. Like people that I know who do this are like, all right, hey, the first couple times you did this to like kind of figure out, you know, what was your rate like? And it's like, oh, I just basically burned out like half the things that I did this with. So don't do this unless you know what you're doing. And like, it's a really fascinating topic to like take a deep dive of, but you can do this with a screwdriver. Don't do this. But very important for most games consoles is to clean out their thermal systems. Your Xbox 360s, your PS3s, look up a tutorial for how to re-thermal paste it. Just like your GPU or whatever in your PC, you want to replace that thermal paste. That original factory thermal paste is probably all dried up and is not providing like sufficient, you know, heat transfer anymore. So get yourself the proper tools, look up a tutorial, and you know, do it, or find somebody that feels comfortable doing it. Like if you can re-thermal paste your GPU in your system, I'm confident you can do this as well. And also, whenever you're taking something apart, I recommend just taking photos of the whole process, because you can go back and be like, well, where was that again? And then you've got a photo of it so you know, okay, well, that screw goes over there, that screw goes over there. Sometimes they're different screws. Replace your drive bands in your old systems. You can like one problem that original Xboxes have is their drive bands go like they lose their tension. You can get replacements for them. You can like a lot of systems die because their operating systems get corrupted, but obviously there's reinstallation utilities for these things. If you can install an operating system on a computer, you can reinstall the operating system for your game consoles. And if you're going to upgrade or service something, think about whether or not to replace like the 2.5 HDD with an actual SSD. They're faster. They can provide you better storage. So if you're actually going to fully tear something apart, you might as well think about like cloning the drive from one to another, so you get like more storage space and so on. But one little PSA, one little request I have for you is, if you have something that is in disrepair, and you can't or you don't want to fix it, rather than throw it in the landfill, consider donating it to like a local game shop or an electronic repair service. If they do video game repair work, there's a good chance that they can use it with their own backstock of junk parts, because you never know when you might need a particular screw or button or membrane or shell piece, or like a whole power supply. You can get like if you have like a game console that the optical drive is bad on one and the power supply is bad on another one, you can put the parts together and you have a whole system that works again. And you might not have enough things at home to do that, but they do. So your local game store, the back of it is going to look like this. They're just going to have rows and rows of dead things that they can pull parts from, and they can make use of it. So like, look at all those dead Xboxes. Look at all those dead PS2s. So I'm sorry to say, I don't really have time for questions, but if you have questions afterwards, like, hey, where do I find blah, blah, what's a good thing for blah, 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 you can contact me. I'm happy to provide you feedback. My email is on there. For any panels you're doing this weekend, leave them feedback in guidebooks so we know what's good. And drink water. Very important. Thank you.